So, I'm John, and welcome to the Experience Cafe. And I'm really pleased today to have Phil Gilbert with me on the couch to talk about design thinking. Phil's got an eminent career behind him, but Phil, maybe do you want to give us a quick intro to yourself?
Sure. I use design thinking. I don't really think about myself as a design thinker. I did 30 years in startups. So after I got out of university, I spent a few years at a large consulting firm, which is kind of more, now it's KPMG. But I did 3 startups over 30 years. And my third company got bought by IBM. And at IBM, I was asked to help lead the transformation of IBM into a much more entrepreneurial organization, more creative solution problem capabilities. And in that capacity, my design thinking chops really came to the forefront. And that's, I guess that's what I'm known for now.
Fantastic. So tell me 2 truths and a lie, and I'll try and distinguish which is the lie.
2 truths and a lie. Well, we're sitting here in London. So, number 1, my first company called Gilbert and Associates, creatively enough, had our European offices on St. James's Street, right at St. James's and German streets. And we had the top 2 floors, and above the rotunda, whenever I was in town, we flew the flag.
Which one?
Oh, the Gilbert and Associates flag.
Oh, right. As opposed to the US or
No,
Union
Gilbert
Jack.
Associates
Okay.
flag. So that's number 1. Number 2, I've cycled with Sir Bradley Wiggins. Number 3, I recorded a record in Bradford and won a songwriting award.
Wow. Okay. That's an interesting selection. Oh, I'm going to go with Bradley Wiggins as a lie.
You're right.
Okay.
But Bradley, if you're out there, I'd love to cycle with you.
Take note. Fantastic. So you've got a song behind you that's out there and on Spotify somewhere. I'm going to have to look it up now.
This is way before Spotify. No,
Okay.
I don't think it ever made it to digital.
Fantastic. Well, that's really, really interesting. So from Phil Gilbert and Associates all the way to now, I guess on the topic of design thinking, why is design thinking so important?
So design thinking to me is, I think of it as the scientific method for the 21st century, because it brings together diverse teams to look at who can deal with the complexity of problems today and the volatility of our environment, because by its nature, you bring together interdisciplinary teams. It's one of the foundations of it. And one of the problems when you bring together interdisciplinary teams and you have all of these different points of view is, the real problem is, okay, whose point of view gets prioritized? You know, it's one of the issues, I think, with Agile. Agile doesn't really have a perspective on, a true North Star of what gets done. It does things quickly. Design thinking says, well, the prioritization goes to the person you're serving, the human being that is the user at the center of the problem that you've uncovered. And when you bring in that perspective, all of a sudden you can gain alignment by these diverse stakeholders and these diverse constituencies with a speed and with a precision that I've never experienced outside of design thinking. So that to me is, why it's powerful and why it's particularly powerful for these times. Because it helps us prioritize our work. And because we're focused on the human and we can gain empathy with that human, it also provides a moral imperative, but also an emotional incentive to do our best work.
Really, and so what I'm hearing is there's a really great kind of cross-pollination between design thinking and agile ways of working.
Absolutely.
And if you can bring those 2 things together, that's where you get something really powerful. Now, in terms of, people also talk about enterprise design thinking. So how do you distinguish between what you described there and enterprise design thinking? How would you define that?
Yeah, so look, you can go to any number of places and read about design thinking. You can experience design thinking, and design thinking works at any scale. One of the unique opportunities that I had here at IBM was this notion of how would you scale a munging together of design thinking and agile, how would you scale that to hundreds of thousands of people? Working in a very distributed environment globally, working on teams that themselves are distributed globally. And how do you get them really aligned quickly? And so as we work through very traditional design thinking exercises, and no magic to that, what we found were a few very specific scaling tactics that we used that allowed us, primarily through vocabulary, but also the practices around that vocabulary, we found a very unique few specific tactics to insert into the middle of very generic design thinking that allowed us to talk about it at scale, to align around it at scale, and then to execute it at scale. And so enterprise design thinking, we originally, the first time I literally wrote it down in 2012, it was called IBM Design Thinking. Once we decided that we were going to create, essentially open source our design program, we wanted anybody in the world to adopt this, to learn this approach and to adopt this approach. And if they wanted to adopt our approach, that's great. We went to a more generic name and we called it enterprise design thinking. So that was the genesis of it. But it's all about how do you do design thinking, very generic design thinking, how do you do it at scale across a big organization with some measurability across those teams and with precision of language. And
to your point, you've been on this journey with IBM for the last 10 years.
Right at 10 years, yeah.
Taking IBM through that transformation. I'm just curious, based on the clients that you speak to and organizations externally, where do you think the rest of the enterprise outside is in terms of their journey of adoption or maturity in the market?
Yeah. Well, look, let me start with us. We're at the beginning, right? This is a forever thing. Design thinking itself is an iterative process, and the companies I always look to that really didn't necessarily use the term design thinking, but the companies that I use as exemplars of great long-term design, people like Herman Miller or Nike or Braun, Bang & Olufsen. These are brands that when you hear their names, you know what they stand for, and there's a point of view presented by their, and this has been decades and decades in the making of relentlessly design thinking. Their entire cultures are aligned around the value prop of design as the magic ingredient that makes them pop in the marketplace. So from that perspective, we're early in our journey, and I think that most of the enterprises I talk to are very early in theirs. If we started ours 10 years ago, some of them started it 5 years ago. We're having conversations, as you know, today and tomorrow with companies that are getting ready to start on the journey. That's okay. We're all going to learn about this together. And some of the mistakes we made, hopefully our clients won't make. And we'll learn from some things that they do better than us. And that's the way it should be.
And you mentioned some great examples there in terms of benchmark companies, primarily in the consumer space.
Yeah.
And I can totally understand that in terms of consumer product organizations, but I think it's fair to say, design thinking is pervasive and it's applicable to everything, right?
Yeah.
Whether you're in B2B, healthcare, consumer, industrial, utilities. And I guess it's pervasive in terms of not just front-end customers, but it's also right the way through your value chain, right? Internally and externally, to really kind of get your pace of change aligned to really your goals. What's the biggest challenge in making that journey to get to that point? It must be, paved with potholes.
Paved with potholes, yeah. Well, let me start off by saying that the book of change was written by a guy named John Cotter in the late 90s, called Leading Change. And in that book, there's laid out 8 kind of error conditions, and you can go read that. There's a couple of others that I think typically companies stumble over. First of all, I think most companies they view enablement as change, and they overvalue training. I'm not saying that you don't train as a part of change, but training and having, humans in seats in education classes is not an outcome. And it's certainly not an outcome that a business values. And yet so many change management programs have training and have you signed up for the training as one of the core metrics. So that's number one, is it's not about enablement, it's about adoption and behavior change. And if you accept that, then you need to start changing the metrics by which you evaluate the program, even in the early days. That it's about, how do I assess the behavior of the teams building things, not about whether they've been trained or enabled to do that. That requires a mindset change that seems pretty obvious, but to be honest, I see very few companies with that mindset. That it's the adoption of behavioral change by teams that is the real thing you're going after. When you go there, what it means is that as you're rolling out your program, it means that the onus is not on the team to change. The onus is on the central transformation group to envision and deliver a program that team wants to change to. So it's a whole different perspective in how I communicate with that team and with the organization. What's my tone? What are my materials? And how can I gain empathy with the problems of that team in the new practices so that these new practices are easier for that team to adopt than their old ones? So this notion of it's about adoption, not enablement, I think is a really fundamental error condition that we see over and over. The second one is companies oftentimes don't have the fortitude to actually realistically understand the time it's going to take. And we expect change too quickly, too globally. Whereas what we've found is if you start very small and you have massive successes in places that matter, even if they're small numerically to the size of your organization, for example, then the successes that you have there, that will scale pretty quick. But a change journey happens over years. It doesn't happen over quarters. And most companies don't realistically acknowledge that up front, and they don't actually have the fortitude to see it through. If it's anything like we've experienced here, and I think most are, the change takes a little bit longer than you probably want it to, but when it happens, it's much more impactful than you expected.
Too true. And does the change, could you drive a transformation bottoms up, or does it need to come top down?
I think it's both. But the hard work is primarily, in my opinion, bottom up. What we see missing quite a bit, there has to be a massive communications effort that keeps the top engaged, but the work has to be done at the bottom. We typically see very senior leaders of organizations understand the need for transformative change. It's not much of a stretch to say, topic 1 or 2 in the C-suite of every company is we have to move faster. And we have to do it at the same or better quality than today.
Yeah.
Okay. So they get it. The people doing the work, they know. And so both of those constituencies are where you start. And then, what we found is all of the folks in the middle, they sometimes get a bad rap for resisting change. We actually found that wasn't the case. But what does need to happen is during the transformation program, most programs don't contemplate the new pressures on middle management. Middle management is kind of where the rubber hits the road. It's probably the hardest jobs in the organization because you're translating strategy and you're communicating up. While at the same time, you're very actively working and managing your teams and getting to conclusions, to outcomes. So you're translating tactics and strategy every day. And most folks have a way of doing that. And they understand the artifacts that their teams are generating. They understand where teams are. They typically have a pretty good idea of when teams are going to go off the rails to step in. When you bring in a transformative set of practices, and maybe even new people as well as we did with designers, the problem isn't that our line management was resistant to change. Our problem that we found was we hadn't given them the tools to manage the new teams. And so when the new teams would come with different artifacts, they would come with different things that told the story of where they were in their journey of delivery. We hadn't enabled our people to understand that. When we did, when we figured that out, and we developed new ways to educate everybody on how our teams were working at the bottom with design thinking and Agile, it changed everything. We got no resistance. All of a sudden, the last resistance, if you will, was gone. And that's when we really started scaling.
Fantastic. That's a great segue to my next piece.
So
So just a little bit more back to you again. I got a couple of 10 questions here, just quickly rapid fire.
All right.
To get a bit more about who you are and what makes you tick. So, morning or evening?
Morning.
Diet or exercise?
Exercise.
Email or chat?
A chat.
Yes or perhaps?
Yes.
CES or Wimbledon?
Wimbledon.
Nice choice. Yeah, disruption or transformation?
Ooh, disruption, probably.
Cloud or GDPR?
Cloud.
Video or phone call?
Phone.
Consult or direct?
Consult.
Speed or accuracy?
Speed.
Fantastic. On that note, Phil, we all learn about our failures, and sort of one of the journeys we've been on around is also taking account what works, what doesn't, and actually some of the biggest learning points is the things when it doesn't work. I mean, what's maybe one or two of your biggest kind of failures and learning points that you've taken away from that for folks?
Yeah. Whew. There's a lot. I've had a long career, so I've got a lot to draw back on.
Offer.
Yeah. I've got a lot to offer. One the things that come to mind are more recent in terms of kind of, I'd say in the last 10, I've got many failures going way back. We could go, it's a long couch, so let me lay down here. But one of the things that we discovered when we did our program here, and it took me way too long to figure this out, or us, I should say. We all, anyway. We brought these teams through, started bringing teams through and into our transformation program. There was a whole kind of, we designed a methodology to do that, so it was team by team, and we'd work with these teams. And by and large, when they came into the program, they got onboarded, and by and large, everybody, they bought in. They saw the benefits, or they saw the potential benefits from working in these new ways. They adopted in. After a couple of quarters, I noticed that there were some teams where everybody was on the same page. We had designers and engineers and product managers all working together. They were doing design thinking, and they were putting the needs of the user first, and they were ruthlessly prioritizing their backlogs. And they were doing all the stuff, but they were churning. And there were other teams that were doing better. And we started looking into these teams that were, they were not obstructionists. They had open mindsets. They were bought in, and they were genuinely, maybe even not just trying to do, but genuinely doing many of the practices. And they had many useful insights from their user research, and they were churning. And we dug into this more and more because I just didn't understand how we could have such a harmonious, positive behaviors with people doing, generally speaking, good work, and we weren't delivering. They weren't finishing anything. Mm. And when we dug into it, we found that we had built an entire culture that was really embracing the agile notion of empowered teams. And with design thinking, we added onto that diverse empowered teams, so interdisciplinary teams, and they were fully empowered to, they were fully empowered. They were staffed end to end with the full team that could deliver something to market. It was all of the skill sets. For example, the company had put the power into them. Go, deliver, do. What we hadn't appreciated is that in this new world, we pushed power and responsibility down, but we had never trained the business owners on those teams that were relatively early in their careers. We had never trained them to make decisions. Mm. So, the thing that most people in big companies say is, "Oh, I can't do that. So and so won't let me do that," or "We have a policy, I can't do that." And this kind of, we almost build victim cultures in a way. And all of a sudden, one day, the company changes and says, "Go, you have the power." Well, wait a minute. I don't know how to exercise that power. And that was a real interesting kind of learning, because again, that was a whole, wow, that was a bigger thing than just a workshop. Teaching people how to make decisions then became part of the program itself, because we had really only cultivated that at fairly, manager and senior levels.
And maybe we could follow on. It says, in your experience, have you been able to draw a link between successful adoption of design thinking, enabling that business decision making, and business outcomes, and kind of quantifying that? Says, when you get the design right through this process, actually the value is 10x or whatever the number is, right?
Yeah.
Have you managed to draw that conclusion?
We have.
That link?
We have. We've done it a couple of ways. One is, a few years ago, we retained Forrester to actually look at it and look at the outcomes of teams that were working in one way versus the other. And they did a lot of work with our internal teams, and then they also did some work with some client teams that had adopted our enterprise design thinking, as we talked about earlier. And they found a direct correlation. And that report's available, and you can find it. There were a couple of super interesting things in that report. The high-level numbers are, a team working in this way will, generally speaking, be twice as apt to hit the mark in the marketplace with the first version of something. And it will be about 30% more efficient in getting there. So a third faster, twice as good in a sense. And they documented it. It's actually pretty quantitatively documented. One of the most interesting attributes of that value prop, though, which I find interesting, especially with corporate cultures today and organizational cultures today, is about 20% of the value is actually in improved employee retention and morale. Mm. So there's a huge aspect of quality of work here as well for the individual. And again, I think in these times, when the fight in the marketplace for talent is so hard, that number probably would be even higher today. The other way to think about it is actually looking at adoption metrics in the same way that we treated our program with adoption, the things that we look to in our outcomes are comparable adoption, pre and post, and the adoption of our products and services in a post-design thinking team is much higher. But figuring out how to measure those adoption metrics, that in and of itself took us some time to do. Probably a couple of years of tinkering to figure out, what does it mean to adopt and how do we measure that? What's an active user? And of course it varies from product to product, service to service, but we absolutely see a connection between adoption and between those outcomes.
And driving outcomes.
Yeah.
And I guess for someone who's kind of starting down this journey, right, of driving design thinking embedded in the culture and the ways of doing things, what would your biggest piece of advice be for someone who's kind of either starting this journey or sort of midway through and kind of muddling through to try and get there? I mean, what would your top tip be in terms of?
Yeah, most of what I see and hear are, folks that are either struggling or want to get started. The question is always, how do I get a seat at the table, basically, right? I'm not valued. Don't people understand design thinking is good? Or don't people understand design is good?
Yeah.
And, I tell them, your organization does not give a whit about design thinking. And it never will. But they do care. An organization does care about outcomes. And, I find that too many times we talk about design thinking and even design as the goal. It's not the goal. The outcome is the goal. And we have to adjust our language toward a business language of articulating, why design thinking drives outcome metrics that are relevant to the enterprise or the organization that you're talking about. And I think that is a big gap in language between a lot of folks that are evangelizing design thinking and, like I said, even design. And so when I speak to designers or when I speak to people who want to drive design thinking, into their organizations, I typically try to work with them to understand, what does the company value? What does the organization value? And I'm the number one believer. Design thinking will help. I promise you it will. But until we can articulate how it will help that organization with their metrics, it's not going to get a lot of airplay. So that's kind of the one thing I'd say is normalize your language around outcomes. The second thing that I would, say is there's a million. Good ideas are a dime a dozen. I hear so many people come up to me, but this is a good idea. This is a good idea. And, yes, it is. That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Anything can be a good, I'm an entrepreneur. Anything can be a good idea if you execute it well. But companies are run by humans, and humans have limited bandwidth. And so the other thing I would say is figure out what your organization's objectives are. And there will probably be 3 or 4. And then figure out how your good idea, design thinking, for example, how does it move the needle on one or more of those? Because good ideas in the abstract, unattached to any corporate agenda, fritter away.
Just another good idea.
It's just another good idea. But if it's attached to a corporate agenda, and you can make the business connection as to why you'll accelerate the achievement of that, now you have something.
Really? Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So just maybe to conclude, so you spent the last 10 years focused on how to drive design thinking in a very large organization. Yep. Where's the topic of design? Where's it going to be in 5-10 years time? Do you think is there a new challenge? We've got the metaverse. We've got all these new interesting things. It's not,
You asked me earlier if it was CES versus Wimbledon, and I said Wimbledon. Yeah. I don't really like technology, to be honest with you. I've only done it for 45 years, so
it's one extraordinary thing to say.
So what I do know will still be here, no matter what, is human beings, and so I will it be called design thinking? Will design thinking plus Agile be called something else? We call it the garage method. Will it be called something else? I don't know the answer to that, but it will be here. Gaining empathy, companies who build a skill, a scalable skill, a systemic skill, to better gain empathy with their customers and users than their competitors will always win. So from that standpoint, it will always be here. What I think is more interesting, or equally as interesting, is where do we focus our efforts using it? And I think that the big challenge of design in the next decade is designing for trust. I think the overarching mover in the marketplace for organizations of all kinds, whether they're public or private, is going to be whether people trust you. And I think we're in an age of declining trust, and I don't think we've bottomed out. Mm. And so companies and brands and people who can be trusted are going to be differentiated. And I think that is if it's authentic of a company or an individual, I think there will be increased intentionality around how do I expose my trustworthiness. That's a design challenge. And I think it's a challenge for the decade. And I think it's going to be, I'm not a doom and gloom. It's not make or break. Well, if this doesn't work, we're done for. I'm not there. But I do think it's going to be a defining characteristic of the next decade of where we are in the 2030s as to how good we as designers and design thinkers communicate the trust that I, as a relative optimist, actually believe our organizations deserve.
Really, really interesting. And maybe just to finish it off, sustainability has obviously been a big topic. And do you see sustainability entwined in that theme of trust, or do you think it's slightly different?
I think it's underneath that. I think that is I think that's an element of authentically pursuing being a trusted organization.
And doing something sustainably underpins that in terms of your values and how you execute.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Phil, it's been fantastic speaking to you.
Thanks,
really
John.
Insightful discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
My name's John, and you've been with the Experience Cafe.
Great.